Uh, Hey folks, welcome to April Pilots, Rose Brides, and Gualamachi, Heroic Trauma and Anime. I'm Frobor, Jed Blue, I go by both. Thank you all for coming out so early right at the beginning of the con. Give you a little bit of background, I'm the author of both The Very Soil, Critical Study of Gualamachi Magica. I've been studying and writing about animation for several years now, and I'm currently working on a project called The Near Apocalypse of '09, which is about heroic trauma in the DC animated universe. And I figured I would combine those two interests and do heroic trauma in anime. So before I start, spoiler warning. Nothing I talk about is more recent than 2011, but I am sure there will be spoilers here for, there's definitely going to be spoilers for Neon Genesis Evangelion, Revolutionary Girl Lieutenant, Gualamachi Magica, and Fullmetal Alchemist, both anime. Also, just general content warning, this is a panel about trauma. Mostly in a theoretical sense or happening to fictional people, but I will be talking about traumatized characters, and the things that traumatize them will be coming up. So there will be mentions of child abuse, incest, violence, unpleasant stuff. So just give you a heads up warning that stuff is going to be mentioned. I'm not going to dwell on it, I'm going to talk more about its effects, but nonetheless. So let's jump straight in. What is trauma? Now, trauma means different things in different fields. I'm specifically talking here about psychological trauma, which is basically defined as any kind of stress that overwhelms your ability to cope with stress. There's discrete trauma and there's continuous trauma. Discrete trauma is a single traumatic event. Continuous trauma is something that extends over a long period of time. They can both be trauma, they result in slightly different effects, but they're still quite similar. It's fundamentally subjective in the sense that because everybody is stressed at different amounts by different things, and everybody has different coping mechanisms with different levels of effectiveness at dealing with different kinds of stress, the same kinds of events can be traumatic for some people and not for others. That said, there's certain common features to events that are experienced as trauma, things that are usually true of something that's going to be experienced as trauma. Usually it involves some kind of feeling of betrayal or abandonment or abuse. This can be literal in the sense of someone you trusted is betraying that trust. It can be a little bit more metaphorical in the sense of things that you're used to being able to rely on as someone who no longer available to you or can no longer be trusted. It often involves a feeling of isolation, a feeling that you're entirely alone in dealing with this. It often involves a loss of control, a feeling of helplessness, a feeling that you can't stop it from happening. Very often it involves violence or threat of violence, but not always. And violence can be what we normally think of as violence with one person trying to hurt another, but it can also be things like natural disasters. And the one thing that all trauma has in common, because that's what makes it trauma, is long-term damage to the person's psyche. And that damage causes specific symptoms. The one I think we're most familiar with in pop culture is the flashback, where something forcibly reminds the trauma sufferer. They encounter some kind of a trigger, and it either causes them to vividly remember the traumatic event and re-experience the pain that they felt at that time, or this is less commonly shown in pop culture, but this is quite common in real life. Instead of actually remembering the event, they'll just start feeling the emotions associated with the event without any conscious memory. Because another major symptom of trauma is memory loss, particularly of events before the trauma or of the trauma itself. And it is possible for those to be combined. It is possible for someone to have no memory of the trauma, but they still have flashbacks in an emotional sense to the trauma. Inappropriate emotional responses are also a very common symptom. What I mean by inappropriate is bursting out laughing at a funeral, crying and panicking when someone hugs you. Things that are not the expected behavior, but that's how the person feels. And basically, because this stress has overwhelmed their ability to cope with it, their emotional responses to things get altered. Another very common one that's going to show up a lot in what we're talking about, are dissociation and depersonalization. They're related but not quite the same thing. Depersonalization is when you start feeling either that you're not real or that you're not a real person, that you're a thing. Dissociation is emotional detachment. It's no longer connected with the events around you and withdrawn from them. In extreme cases, as in dissociative identity disorder, dissociation can actually get to the point where an alternate you goes and does things and you have no memory of what they did. Blackouts are a form of dissociation. What used to be called multiple personalities is a kind of dissociation. Related to that is this fragmentation of identity. Very often trauma sufferers feel like a different person than they were. Either they'll feel like a different person than they were before the trauma, or they'll start to have doubts about who they really are. They, again, extreme cases of what used to be called multiple personality disorder, dissociative identity disorder, where they actually now feel like they're multiple people. It just causes this loss of identity and this breakdown of identity. Anxiety and depression, very often experienced by trauma sufferers, and all of these things often add up to a real problem dealing with relationships, a tendency to withdraw and isolate. Okay, so that comes the trauma half of the equation. What's a hero? So the study of heroes goes back to Aristotle. People have been talking about people have been talking about heroes for as long as there have been people in all likelihood. Certainly the oldest piece of fiction we have is the epic adventures of a hero, it's the Epic of Gilgamesh. But a study of them, the formal study of them goes back about 2,500 years to Aristotle. And there's a few different ways of defining a hero. My favorite way of defining a hero is something one of my college professors said, Professor Rutledge, who defined a hero as someone you point in the general direction of your enemies and hope they die tragically before they get home because you really don't want them for a neighbor. Basically, a hero is someone who engages in extraordinary adventures. They have extraordinary capabilities, they rise to extraordinary challenges, and it results in stories that are exciting or entertaining in some way. There's a few different ways of classifying heroes. For example, we can identify them by genre. So for example, you've got the epic hero, who is this larger-than-life figure who goes against extraordinary, usually supernatural challenges, rises to meet them, fights a great battle, and founds an entirely new order. At the end of their story, they start a new country, where they revolutionize the way the world works, where they steal fire from the gods, or something that just changes the whole world. Alternatively, we've got tragic heroes, who seem like epic heroes at first, but they've got some kind of innate flaw that causes everything to come tumbling down. We've got historical heroes, where we, dramatize people from real history and play them up to be these great figures that we can, as opposed to just ordinary people. Now, these are great people that have extraordinary adventures and really interesting lives. In our culture, we did that to Washington. We're currently doing that to Hamilton, thanks to a certain news award. Or you can divide them up by what kind of traits they have, what kind of people they are. And these can show up in any of those genres. But you can have the godlike hero. The hero who is simply the best at everything. Your, Goku from DBZ. Your character who just absolute pinnacle of power. Your Superman. In fact, yeah, Superman's a pretty good example. Or you've got your reluctant hero, the person who has to be dragged kicking and screaming into the adventure. But once they're out there, they do great, extraordinary things. My favorite is the inverse. But there's tons of examples of those in anime, where the person just wants to be ordinary, but then they go on the grand adventure. Fools and tricksters are very closely related to heroes. The fool very often becomes a hero, and trickster, you've got trickster heroes, people who, Odysseus is a classic example of somebody who's depicted as a hero. His main thing is going around tricking people and things. He came up with the Trojan horse, that kind of thing. Fools very often become heroes because they don't realize how much danger they're in, or they don't realize that the thing they're attempting is impossible, and they don't do it anyway. Gurren Lagann is a great example of a team of fools becoming great heroes. Now, very popular nowadays, especially in our culture, but all over the place really, are anti-heroes. An anti-hero is someone who fulfills the story role of a hero, but doesn't have the traits of a hero. This could mean, for example, that they're a coward, but forced to do things that appear heroic. It could mean that they're just in it for the money, but turns out the best available money is to be a hero. It could be because they're actually, completely immoral, but through coincidence they end up saving the world. My favorite example there, because again, I'm a big Slayers fan, is Zealous, who at one point actually gets the line, "You can't destroy the world, I get to destroy the world." Some good examples of anti-heroes. The great Western. So every culture gets like one great epic, except the ancient Greeks who got two. The great epic of the English language is usually regarded as being known as Paradise Lost. And it's really interesting because it's got an anti-hero instead of an epic hero. Its hero is Satan, who is not a nice guy. And the great revolution to the world he brings is he introduces death and suffering. You've got, we tend to really like our Byronic heroes, your figure that's all noble and suffering and likes to gaze out and talk about how much his life is pain and, your vampires, your, that kind of figure. Very romantic, but kind of insufferable. And we love our unlikely heroes, our ordinary people, our people who should not be heroes, our Cowboy Bebop cast. We also, and this is particularly a Western thing, are in love with martyrs. We love heroes who suffer and die and still win. There's a difference between a martyr and a tragic hero, because a tragic hero fails. A martyr succeeds but dies in the process. And they demonstrate how much of a hero they are, not through their successes, but through their pain, through their suffering. They suffer, and through that, that's what we regard as being heroic about them. And that's the key to the heroic trauma model. So the heroic trauma model originates in the study of superhero comics. Basically what you've got going on in superhero comics is comics claim to have continuity. They claim that the Superman you're reading about today is the same Superman that was being written about in 1930. This is obviously false. For the simple reason that it's impossible. You can't have a series run for 100 years with 80 different authors and have anything like continuity. What happens instead is past events tend to get repeated. They'll show the origin story 8 million times. For example, every time they make a movie. You get distortions of past events to bring them in line with what the mood of the now is. So, for example, Spider-Man got bit by a radioactive spider in 1967, and in the 2000s movies, it's a genetically engineered spider. The result of this is that superhero comics actually function more like memory than they function like history. Because the thing about memory is that when you recall past events, you're not playing a video file that's stored somewhere in your brain. You're taking impressions and reassembling the memory. And the result is that your memories are very colored by what's going on in your life right now. They're colored by your mood, they're colored by your current interests, they alter with time, and that's very much how it works in comics. And then we look at superheroes themselves, and what we see is that superheroes are almost always born out of trauma. Batman is a great example. He saw his parents die in front of him, and that's what turned him into Batman. Superman's planet blew up, and that's what turned him into Batman. Spider-Man, starting with the Superman. Spider-Man, though that would be an interesting episode. Spider-Man, he's interesting because his trauma is not getting bitten by a spider. Getting bitten by a spider turned him into a wannabe professional wrestler. It's witnessing his father figure getting murdered in front of him that turned him into Spider-Man. They survive these traumas, but they continuously reiterate them. Have you ever noticed that the big stories for superheroes are often in some way a repeat of their origin? Part of that is because we retell the origin, but part of that is also, for example, what is, after his origin, what's the best known Spider-Man story? It's the death of Gwen Stacy. A time in which someone he loved was killed right in front of him and he couldn't do anything about it. The most famous Batman stories are about the members of the Bat family getting killed or horribly injured right in front of him, and he can't do anything about it. Superman's second most famous story, The Death of Superman, has Doomsday, oh hey look, another word for the end of the world, showing up and killing him and causing him to split into multiple people, and it's ridiculous. The point is that the great superhero stories are often, in a sense, flashbacks to the trauma of their origin. And as for fragmented identities, yes, Spider-Man, Peter Parker, Batman, Bruce Wayne, Superman, Clark Kent, Kal-El, their identities get broken and they take great effort to keep their identities separate for, let's face it, no particular reason. So they're constantly coming back to their trauma, they're constantly re-experiencing their trauma. Superheroes are traumatized. But that's superhero comics, and we're here to talk about anime. And 15 minutes in the panel, I'm finally going to talk about anime. So the question is heroic trauma a thing in anime? And there's a lot of reasons that you might want to say no. For starters, anime don't run for 100 years. So they don't have that whole, they behave more like memory than history thing. Usually, with anime and manga, you have one team for the entire run. So they, again, don't have that problem. They're a lot less prone to retellings. What you get in anime and manga, especially shonen anime and manga, which is probably the one that most resembles Western superheroes, is instead of retelling past events from within your story, you retell the same event across multiple stories. So, for example, every shonen anime has a tournament. They all have a beach episode. You know, you retell these. So, the end result is that anime doesn't behave more like memory. It behaves more like a history, more like a story. It's also, you know, martyrs are a big thing in Western culture. They're not as big a thing in Japan. Certainly there are characters who suffer, and certainly there are heroes who suffer, but look, when it comes down to it, we're obsessed with martyrs because of Jesus. And so it's very possible that Japan isn't quite so obsessed, but I am an expert on animation, not on Japanese culture and religion. So I'm going to put that as a possible. But at the same time, even after all that, there are clearly traumatized heroes. There are clearly heroes who suffer tremendously. There are clearly heroes who are in pain and who have these kinds of traumatic experiences, who flash back to them, who have symptoms that resemble trauma. So when we're talking about heroic trauma in anime, we can't, it's not like superhero comics where we can just kind of say, yeah, it's an element, effectively. Ones that don't have no rare. Instead, we have to be careful and look for specific markers that say, yes, this is a heroic trauma. So, what are some, by the way, has anybody here seen Psycho? It's so good. And the only reason I didn't put it in this panel is because I was pretty sure nobody's seen it. But amazing thing about, very much about heroic trauma. But traumatized heroes. The things we want to look for are heroes that have symptoms of trauma and who are not healed in the course of the story. Because that's one of the key things about superheroes and the heroic trauma model of heroism is that the trauma is essential to the heroism. The trauma is what makes them a hero. So if they heal, it's something that happens at the very end, either as a consequence of the ending or causing the ending. They can't heal 10 episodes into a 30-episode series. The trauma has to be associated with their powers or with their origin. It has to have some kind of connection, like either they got their powers in a traumatic event, or using their powers traumatizes them, or they originated, the thing that made them a hero was a traumatic event. And the series has to have a structural similarity to traumatic memory and symptoms. What I mean by that is you need to have either literal flashbacks to the trauma within the series, like you keep re-showing the traumatic event that shaped the character, or you have to repeat it metaphorically. The characters have to keep experiencing events that are echoes of their initial trauma. So, that all said, let's talk about some series that are good candidates for heroic trauma. Yeah. So, one of the interesting things about Evangelion is that it originates, not the characters, but the series itself originates in trauma. This is pretty well established at this point. This series, and particularly its ending, were a response to Anno's depression and treatment following the death of his parents. In particular, if you know anything about cognitive behavioral therapy, it's really obvious that the last 2 episodes are just Shinji going through cognitive behavioral therapy. You've also, however, got a traumatic event as kind of the backstory, because Second Impact is exactly the kind of natural disaster that tends to result in large numbers of traumatized people. In the wakes of earthquakes, hurricanes, that kind of thing, those have all the ingredients to create trauma. And so the death of half the population of the world, the destruction of a whole bunch of cities, and the breakdown of society in the aftermath, that's a recipe for a lot of traumatized people, which probably explains why essentially the entire cast is, if not outright traumatized, at least severely messed up. You've also got tons of parental neglect and abandonment, which is also a thing that very commonly causes trauma. For Shinji, you've got the death of his mother and his father's complete neglect of him. For Rei, and that's why I put in this picture, Rei grew up in one of the most horrifying neglectful environments I've ever seen. Like, she grew up in a room with no walls, being experimented on. She had no one who, loved her, no one who cared about her. She got food and she got education, and that was it. I mean, that level of neglect, I'm surprised she could even talk. Then you've got Asuka, whose mother half the time didn't know who she was, and the other half tried to kill her. Again, practically guaranteed recipe for trauma. And kind of a lesser case, Misato's father, who was absent or abusive or something. It's never made entirely clear what her real thing is. But he did die when she was quite young, and that's also potentially traumatic. And these all have in common that their traumas caused by separation, their traumas caused by isolation, their traumas caused by people who should be around not being around, which is a major theme of the series. Essentially, the Human Instrumentality Project is let's mush everyone together so nobody can feel abandoned ever again. So nobody's ever alone again. So that's on the individual character level. Let's talk on the structural level. So there's this idea called complex PTSD. There's PTSD and then there's complex PTSD. Complex PTSD is a relatively new idea. I do not believe it's in like the most recent DSM, but it's being discussed in journal articles and so forth. Probably will be in the next one whenever they do it. The idea is that our ideas of PTSD are mostly based on isolated events, on one really bad thing happening to a person. What hasn't been studied so much until recently is what happens to somebody who has continuous trauma. For example, somebody who grew up in an abusive environment, or somebody who, was kidnapped and held hostage for years, or that kind of thing, something where it was stretched over a long period of time. And that has particular symptoms kind of on top of the normal PTSD symptoms. One big one is that very often abuse victims, long-term abuse victims, especially abused children, will become incredibly fixated on praise from their abuser. Anything that pleases their abuser, that makes their abuser happy with them, becomes an incredibly important thing, something they fixate on, something they pursue, something they dwell on. So, for example, you get like 8 straight episodes in which Shinji is obsessing over the one time his dad said, "Good job." Another thing is you very often have disruptive development in long-term abuse victims. People who are abused as children very often, in some areas, their development seems to be accelerated, like they behave in ways much older childhood, and in other areas it seems to be held back, they behave in ways much younger childhood, because in some cases, they had to grow up in a hurry, because they didn't get the things they needed to survive, and in other places, they didn't have the support they needed to develop, so their development slowed down. And you can very clearly see that with Asuka. In some areas, Asuka is very old for her years. She's already graduated college at 14. She's very flirtatious and like almost sexually aggressive at times, but at the same time, like she talks to her doll. She, has these very extreme reactions that are very childish. She throws temper tantrums. So she, in some ways, she behaves like a 6 or 7-year-old. In other ways, she behaves like a 20-year-old, and kind of bounces back and forth between them. She's also very emotionally volatile, which is another common symptom of complex PTSD. This kind of like hot and cold, extreme reactions. When she's angry, she's incandescently angry, or she's world-shatteringly depressed. Shinji is the same way. Shinji is kind of the flip side to Asuka, because Asuka is usually angry, and then when things go bad, she collapses into depression. Shinji is usually depressed, but then when things go bad, he goes berserk. Honestly, of the two, Shinji is scarier. And of course, another common symptom, even more so than with PTSD, is social isolation. Rei. Rei is in utter retreat. She is hiding from virtually everyone. The only person she even connects to a little is Gendo. You've also got revisits to the trauma. The most obvious and literal one is that psychic attack that happens to Asuka in the beginning of the series, which literally forces her to relive her trauma. But you've got other examples. Shinji is sort of continually being abandoned by Gendo over and over again throughout the series. For example, that scene when they visit the mother's grave and then Gendo just kind of leaves to hang out with Rei. Rei keeps dying. Rei's got this really interesting version of fragmented identity, because Rei's identity is so fragmented, there's multiple Reis. There's huge numbers of her, and they're all her, and she doesn't know which one is real, and she doesn't know who she is or what she is. She's extremely dissociated. She is utterly disconnected from her emotions. She has them. We occasionally see glimpses of them. Rei is not emotionless, but she can't express them, and very rarely is able to show how she's feeling, and struggles even to recognize how she's feeling. Like, she can't even tell how she's feeling about things a lot of the time. Another big reiteration, so Shinji, when he was young, was a visited nerd, and that was the day that his mother died. And he's got a lot of guilt over that. It's revealed towards the end of the series where things are getting a little bit hard to follow, but it is pretty clear that he has a lot of guilt over his mother's death, and that she died in an accident involving the Evangelion on the day he is a young child visited. And then, like 2 episodes later, the first person since Yui to tell Shinji that they love him. Shinji has to get his A-Level check. that's definitely that kind of reiteration of a trauma. And his guilt over it reflects his guilt over his mother's death. And that's the straw that breaks him. That's the final thing that just sends him into complete shutdown. And of course, then we get third impact, where it's again reiteration of the second impact. That trauma that affected the entire world, well, now everybody gets to have it again. And this time, nobody survives. Well, a couple people survive, but virtually nobody survives. So, this is kind of what neurotrauma model lets us do, is it allows us to look at a series in a slightly different way. It allows us to look at it instead of as a sequence of events, as an emotional reality. And allows us kind of a different view on the characters and the events as being kind of this working through trauma. The Angels Evangelion in particular is a good example of working through because the end of it, the original ending, the TV ending, the good ending, is Shinji literally working through his trauma. Like I said, the last 2 episodes are cognitive behavioral therapy for Shinji. And it ends with kind of the big idea behind cognitive behavioral therapy, which is that your feelings are a product of how you think about things and how you look at the world. So if you change that, you change how you feel. And that is actually one of the most effective forms of therapy for dealing with trauma. It's slow and it's hard and it's painful, but that is one of the most effective ways of getting through it. Let's talk about a different series with lots of trauma. Let's talk about Revolutionary Girl Utena, the greatest anime of all time. Utena and Anki are both horribly traumatized. They respond to it in very different ways, but they've both got major traumas in their past. The big difference is that Utena has discrete trauma and Anki has continuous trauma. Utena's trauma is the death of her parents. And she's got clear symptoms resulting from it. When her parents died, she shut down completely. It was obviously something that overwhelmed her with the code. She shut down completely, hid in a coffin, unless you take the interpretation that she died with it. That's a whole other story. And then she forgot about it. She does not, she remembers this fairy tale version of what happened. She remembers a prince coming to rescue her, and her deciding to become a prince. Later in the series, we learn, well, not so much. And the result is she does have flashbacks. In particular, that moment when she shut down, when she felt helpless, when she tried to shut herself away from the rest of the world. At the end of the first arc, Toga shows up and claims to be her prince. And the minute Utena starts to believe that he's her prince, she shuts down. She starts wearing a girl's uniform. She becomes very visibly depressed. She starts withdrawing from other people, becoming unresponsive. She's repeating all the same behaviors that she had when her parents died. Because the prince is actually her trigger for re-experiencing that trauma and flashing back to that trauma. Way later, near the end of the last arc, it happens again. She realizes that Akio actually is the prince from back then. And again, she tries to give up on everything. Again, she starts dressing like a girl. Again, she starts, becoming withdrawn, becoming depressed, becoming less energetic. She's flashing back again. And then you've got Anki, who is subjected to horrifying sexual abuse at the hands of her brother, and responds in pretty much exactly the ways you would kind of expect. She severely dissociates. She becomes almost completely incapable of showing her real feelings, to the point that she adopts this whole Rose Bride persona that just play acts at being whoever the person she's with wants her to be. Completely disconnected from what she's feeling underneath. Her identity fragments apart. Literally, she starts being multiple people in the Rose Bride. And even before that, even less literally, she has these two distinct personas of the Rose Bride and the Witch. Not quite to the level of like dissociative identity disorder, but she's still got these two very different modes of behavior that she keeps rigidly separate. I mentioned extreme loss of affect. Affect is when you show how you feel. It's also awareness of how you feel. Auntie has virtually no affect. She's able to fake feeling things, but she has almost no connection to how she actually feels. But then when you make her mad, she will hurt you. I don't know how many people have ever noticed this, but in that early episode where Nanami is playing pranks when they're trying to study, and playing pranks on Auntie. And Auntie is, happily drawing in the margins of her book, making a little flip book, which we then see. Anybody notice what it was she was animating? Rewatch that episode. She's animating an elephant. What happens a couple episodes later to Nanami? Virtually everything bad that happens to Nanami in her wacky hijack episodes are directly traceable to Auntie. She spends the whole rest of the series punishing Nanami for that series of pranks. And she tries to sabotage all of her own relationships. She's in, admittedly, a terrible relationship with Saionji, and she clearly manipulates Utena into winning the Rose Bride Duel and taking her from Saionji. Then once she's in a relationship with Utena, once that relationship starts to get serious towards the end of the series, she deliberately arranges for, she starts trying to push Utena away, and eventually, more or less deliberately, sets things up so that Utena sees her with her brother. She's got really trouble with relationships. But Utena is very much about recovery. So we get this notion that time is broken in Otori Academy. And that's very much like trauma. Like I was saying, one of the big symptoms of trauma is the flashback. You get triggered and suddenly, emotionally, you are back where you were when you were traumatized. And that is my explanation for why time works so weirdly in this series. For example, Mikage has a particular memory. He experienced a trauma with the death of Lamia and the burning of the lab and so forth. And that, he has a particular memory of it that he's constructed. It's not what happened, much like Utena. But when he's forced to re-experience that, deliberately triggered by Akio, it completely rewrites the history of the show. It alters time, because in this show, that flashing back is almost literal. You've also got another example of trauma is the cycle of encounters with the prince. Utena met the prince as a young girl, is Dios, then again Toga shows up, then again Akio shows up. In between you have sort of mini princes like the Onion Prince, and Luka. These characters keep coming back, keep cycling over and over again, just like we were talking about like origin stories and superhero comics. And that whole betrayal of trust that I was talking about, that's essentially what Akio is. That is his character. He is the prince gone wrong. He is the person you are supposed to be able to rely on to save you, that instead hurts you. He's, in Utena's case, that's what her parents did by dying. They were supposed to be there for her. She was supposed to be able to rely on them. They died, and now she can't. For Auntie, it's her betrayal by her brother. He was supposed to be her older brother. He was supposed to protect her, take care of her, so on, and instead he abuses her. It also kind of addresses this notion of the cycle of abuse. Now, abuse victims are not, contrary to popular belief, particularly likely to abuse others. It's the opposite that's true. Abusers, often but not always, were abused themselves. But it's not like most people who are abused are not going to go on to abuse people. But most people who abuse were at some point abused. So we see a little of that. We see, for example, Auntie, betraying the backstab Utena in a very literal way, which is a reflection of her brother's betrayal of her. We see that with Toga, who, at least in the movie, Toga is a survivor of child sexual abuse. Even if he's not, he's being sexually abused by Akio. Because, hey, guess what? Everyone gets abused by Akio. And, you know, it's easy to forget because of the way the characters are drawn, that these are all children except for Akio. Akio is the only recurring adult. Well, there's like one teacher who shows up early on. But of the major characters, Akio is the only one that's an adult. And the oldest of the characters are 17. Utena is only 14. Akio is a messed up dude. And one of the things that's very heavily exploring is because of this cycle of abuse, because of this difficulty in the relationship, because of this tendency to withdraw, love is really hard for a trauma survivor. It's difficult to trust it, it's difficult to fall in love, it's difficult to meet people, it's difficult to not drive them away once you do, it's difficult not to panic and run. And Utena and Anthe are struggling through their own past traumas and their own mistakes to find healing, to find a path to recovery, and to be able to love. Which is why they both have to leave at the end of the series, because they no longer belong in this universe of trauma and broken time and constant flashbacks. They're able to move on. They're able to recover. So that's Utena. I'm going more or less chronological order, so let's talk about Fullmetal. Yeah, this is probably the closest to a superhero origin story of any of the anime we're going to talk about. Ed and Al definitely originated in trauma. They have a dual one. First is, their father abandoned them, but that wasn't such a big deal because they had their mom, except that she died. And then they try to bring her back and the real trauma starts. Not only do they lose their parent, which is traumatic enough, but the system that they had come to rely upon, they trusted in alchemy. They believed in alchemy. They thought it could do anything, and it betrayed them. It horribly hurt them. You've got intense physical suffering, you've got emotional trauma, you've got terror, you've got the system they depend on betraying them. Yeah, they're a bit traumatized. And yet out of this trauma comes both their power and motivation as characters. Their powers, not their alchemy, obviously, they had that prior to this, but, Ed's automaticals, which, he frequently uses to his advantage. Al's body, which has all kinds of, powers. I mean, it's got major drawbacks, but being an animate pseudo definitely has advantages too. These are their powers that make them different from other alchemists, that make them the superheroes of Fullmetal Alchemist. And it also provides them with their motivation. Their whole quest is to get their bodies back. We also get reiteration in flashbacks. Literally. After what happens with Nina, Ed starts having nightmares that equate her with his mother, and particularly his mother in this image. He's experiencing it again. It's reminding, alchemy gone horribly wrong and hurting someone he cares about is causing him to repeat that past trauma. In a lesser sense, it happens when they're in the 5th laboratory. And he is sitting down with his automail not working and death coming right in his face. And hey, that just happened a few days ago with Scar as well. And it's visually depicted in I don't remember the 2003 anime, but in the manga and in the 2009 anime, it's visually depicted that the sword coming for his face becomes Scar's hand. Memory racks back on itself. The events now that remind him of the trauma become indistinguishable of the trauma. But the biggest reiterations, in the 2003 anime, it's Sloth, who is his mother come back wrong, literally. And like her, just as his mother's body was physically distorted when he brought her back, Sloth has that kind of shape-shifting, stretching ability. That's a literal repetition of what happened to his mother. That's that kind of thing I was talking about, that metaphorical repetition of the trauma, as opposed to a little flashback. In the Brotherhood and manga, it's father, who is the father that abandoned. He's the named father. He looks exactly like the father that abandoned them. And he is, just as they think of their father as being cruel, as being, or at least Ed does, thinks of his father as being cruel, as being someone he hates, as being someone who betrayed the people who relied on him. That's all true of father. That's everything father's working on. And father, just as Ed blames Hohenheim for his mother's death, father kills, temporarily, but father kills Winry and Hanako and his new family. Again, the trauma cycles back, the trauma repeats. But eventually, just as in Utena, just as in NGE, there's healing to be found at the end, but only at the end. After father's defeat, after he gives up his alchemy, he becomes whole again, and he's able, Ed, Al literally becomes whole again, and is able to carry on. Ed figuratively becomes whole again, though to an extent literally gets his arm back. And they're able to move on with their lives and in peace, but that means the story's over. Because they're not heroes anymore, now they're just guys that wander around. Because they're no longer in pain. And there's a perfect visual signifier of it. The last, I believe it's the last panel of the manga. I remember it's definitely the last shot of the anime. I've seen the anime, I've seen Brotherhood more recently than I've done the manga. The very last shot is the same photo from when they were kids, and Hohenheim is holding Ed, and Trisha is holding Al as babies, and Hohenheim is crying. And then the last shot of the anime, and I believe the manga, is the exact same positioning, but it's Ed and Winry and their kids, and Ed has this huge shitty thing instead of crying. Like, that right there says everything about healing over the course of this show. All right? Let's talk about Monica Magica. Because, oh heck yeah. I could write a book about trauma and Monica Magica. Oh wait, I did! Among other things. So, the Boiled Magic do not originate from trauma. They're born from wishes. But their heroism is their trauma. They become dragged into despair by fighting the witches, by using their magic. And all of that acts as continual trauma that drags them down. But even before, like for our two main examples that I've used here, Sayaka and Madoka, there even is trauma that helps them, Sayaka in particular, become a witch, become a magic girl, is Mommy's death. Which, yeah, witnessing someone get their head bitten off right in front of you is definitely the sort of thing that can overwhelm your ability to cope. And in both of them, we see evidence of that. The next day, Madoka has that breakdown. But Madoka has an advantage Sayaka doesn't, which is that Madoka has the best parents in all of anime. And so she's able to cry in front of them. They don't understand what the problem is, but they still provide comfort and concern and care, which means Madoka does not feel alone. And it has been shown that the more the support network someone has, the more people they can turn to for help, the less likely they are to become traumatized. You can see that with like natural disasters, that you get large numbers of people traumatized by the same event. And you look at them and you compare who experienced trauma and who didn't. And you can see that people who have more people they can turn to for help, people who have more that they can rely upon, are less likely to become traumatized. And so the result is that Sayaka comes out of that way more messed up than Monica does. But it doesn't matter, because as long as they're magical girls, they're going to get traumatized. Because every good thing they do gets matched with suffering for them. It's that whole balance of despair that Kyubei talks about. But the best example of heroic trauma in Monica Magica is Honma, who's one of my favorite characters in anything ever. I love her. She's terrible. She experiences trauma repeatedly in the first time, the original time. She gets attacked by witches, which is clearly traumatic. Most people kill themselves as a result, if they don't die in the process. But Homura gets rescued, she survives, but then she sees, you know, the girl she loved die horribly in a massive disaster, which, yeah, Walpurgisnacht materializes as a natural disaster. It's mentioned that the people who aren't Koalamanji can't see witches, which means on that first timeline, Homura never actually saw Walpurgisnacht. She saw a natural disaster. She knew, probably intellectually, that there was a witch, but she probably never saw Walpurgisnacht. She probably just saw a natural disaster. She saw Monica and... Was Mommy there in that timeline? She was, wasn't she? Yeah. She saw Monica and Mommy fight and die. And that trauma provokes her to make her wish. And what does that do? She has to re-experience it over and over and over and over. Literally, continually cycling back to her trauma, repeating it, repeating it, repeating it, repeating it. Her experience is constantly cycling, and it traumatizes her over and over again. And she keeps re-experiencing it, just as trauma victims do. The last point I want to make is about dissociation. I misspelled it, didn't I? It's misspelled on the slide. It's dissociation, not disassociation. Those are different things. That's what the witches are. The witches are what happen when the magical girl gets so traumatized that she just can't deal with it anymore and shuts herself off from the rest of the world. That's what the witch's barrier is. It becomes extremely obvious that that's what it is when you start looking at all the Faust references, and you remember that that's literally what happens to Gretchen in Faust, is that she gets all sorts of horrible things happen to her because she's Faust's girlfriend, and she ends up in prison, but she's now so messed up that she doesn't even realize she's in prison. She believes that she's living this happy life while she's stuck in this horrible prison. That's what the witches are, is a complete dissociation. Note also that their identities change. Witches have different names than the original magical girls. It's that fragmentation of identity that's very common in dissociation. But it's difficult to say where this is heading because Monica Magica isn't actually over yet. If we had ended with the end of the series, I would have said, yeah, okay, so it's pretty straightforwardly about healing. Monica creates a safe space. Monica survives trauma and creates a safe space for other trauma victims to come and rest and heal, away from their abuser Kyubei. But then rebellion happened, and now there's something new coming, and I have no idea where it's headed next. But yeah, that is about it. Those are the 4 series I want to cover. There's other things I could talk about, but I elected not to. I could talk about Berserk, but that's... The anime ends with his origin story, so I would have to talk about the manga, and this panel is supposed to be about anime. I could talk about all sorts of other anime. There's tons of examples. But I just wanted to give these 4 to give kind of an idea of this framework that you can use for programming. So that's that. The book, once again, is The Very Soil, non-press critical study of Monica Magica. You can get it at the usual suspects places to get books. You can find me at jedabu.com. I blog there regularly. I'm on Tumblr constantly, far too much. I tweet occasionally, but mostly I use Twitter as a place to share everything I put on my blog and Tumblr. And I have a whole bunch of other panels, which don't have a schedule with me, so I can't tell you when and where they are. But I am doing, actually let me find a schedule. While I'm doing that, are there any questions?
You said that Aura didn't see Walter Disney in the very first timeline. Would that only apply to Walter Disney? That was the wish without a labyrinth?
Yeah, it's kind of an open question, because once you're inside a witch's labyrinth, you can see the witch. But Wolfenstein doesn't have a labyrinth. So it is a bit of an open question. It's possible that she did. To me, it's more interesting if she didn't. It could go either way, honestly. I like to believe that she didn't. But yeah, no, once you're inside the labyrinth, you can see it, but Wolfenstein doesn't have one, so.
Is it okay for you to talk about rebellion?
Yes. Or I'm okay with it.
So in the third movie where Homura becomes trapped kind of in her own labyrinth, would that make her an anti-hero or a villain?
So, read the book. But the short version is, and I'm actually going to be talking about this in my Monica panel, that I believe is later today. Yes, it is. In fact, I'm doing a panel on Monica Magical in panel 309 at 1. And I'm doing a panel at, I'm doing a panel on Utena in panel 310 at 7:30. And then tomorrow I've got a panel on something. I believe tomorrow I'm doing analyzing anime 101. I don't remember when or where. And then on Sunday I'm doing a panel on real world alchemy in Fullmetal Alchemist. But anyway, more or less to answer your question, Homura is everything in Rebellion. Homura is simultaneously the main villain, that villain's main victim, the damsel in distress, and the hero. So yes, I would say that pretty much positions her as an anti-hero, but also. Anybody else? Okay.
Would you say that Homura is kind of cyclical trauma, with it changing very slightly each time, added to the guilt in her complex, or would you say that it was more of a kind of discrete trauma?
I would say that it definitely added to her guilt. Because the thing about a flashback, the thing about being triggered is that you re-experience the trauma, which means it's intensified every time that it happens. So every time she goes through that, she's getting more traumatized, more broken, which is why, for example, after 4 or 5 times, she switches to, she takes out the pigtails, she becomes really blank-faced, her affect is disappearing as she becomes more traumatized. And then as she becomes more traumatized still, eventually she goes full witch. Yeah.
There's been some recent research of trauma affecting families and groups on an almost genetic level. Do you think that there are any good representations of potentially trauma that's been passed on to children or parents who are traumatized?
Xenogears. The first thing that immediately came to mind is Xenogears. It's a little different there because it's like a past life reincarnation thing. But yeah, cross-generational trauma that shows up, that would occur to me immediately as an example. What's that old show called? It's again a reincarnation thing. I think most of the anime examples are going to be more reincarnation than genetics. But Please Save My Earth, I think is what it was called. It's an anime from the 90s. That was, the main cast are all reincarnations of survivors of the destruction of the planet. Those are the 2 that are popping off the top of my head. But yeah, I think there's definitely, you can probably find it in Phoenix. Not necessarily the anime, but the manga. Definitely has this pattern of repeated traumas across generations to characters who look exactly the same in different generations. Yeah. Now, Claire, this is the last one.
I kind of noticed that a lot of the traumatic characters set up as being very heroic, and yet, if you actually follow fandom, they also tend to be sometimes some of the most hated characters. Why do you think some people react so badly to something like that?
It's a very good question. if you didn't hear him, he asked why are some of these like traumatized heroes at the same time, heroic, but also often very hated. And I mean, I think part of it is that we don't like seeing. We don't always like seeing our heroes be weak. Like at one and the same time, we like our heroes to be traumatized because we want them to know what pain is, so that they'll protect us, so that we don't have the problem of you don't want your heroes for neighbors. At the same time, we don't want them to be weak because we want them to be able to protect us. So I think people will often perceive trauma as weakness, which it's really not, because if you have trauma, it means you survive. It's a mark of strength, but we often see it as a kind of weakness, and some people react very negatively to signs of weakness in others. We call these people jerks. So, for example, Shinji has massive hate. Madoka got a lot of hate. Not so much anymore, I don't think. Back when the show was new, she got a lot of hate. So yeah, that would be my first stab at a guess. I don't really know for sure. Anyway, I believe I'm out of time, so thank you all.